Hello and welcome to Sync Music Matters, a podcast that explores the beautiful relationship between music and the moving image. My name's Jim Hostrip and I'm your host on this journey, as each week I chew the fat with industry professionals who, on a daily basis, work with music for visuals. Now you might immediately assume that I'm talking about composers, but I'm also talking about editors, music supervisors, directors, and anyone else who's involved with the synchronous process of pairing audio and visuals. In this episode, I'm talking to composer and sound designer Todd Baker, so you can think of this as a Toddcast. Todd and I discuss how one person can change your life, getting into the game composing industry, blurring the line between music and sound design, overcoming self-doubt and imposter syndrome, the impact of personal life on professional life, and Top Gun. Yes, that's right, so whilst we do go deep, we also make time for Maverick. Now, Todd shares some incredible music that has influenced him, which I highly recommend checking out. You can find links to everything we discuss in the show notes on my website at larpmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast, and Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Todd is a composer and sound designer who works primarily in games. Now, when we think of music and visuals, we generally think of TV and film, but audio plays a pivotal role in creating an immersive gaming experience and often serving the kind of complex narrative you would find in film. Todd's unique sound can be heard on BAFTA-nominated games such as Monument Valley 2 by Ustwo Games, Media Molecule's Dreams and Tearaway on the PS4, and Alto's Odessy from Team Alto. Todd has even been commissioned by Google to provide the music for a Google Doodle for Earth Day 2020. As well as being a master of composition and sound design, Todd is also a phenomenal guitarist and co-founding member of the prog jazz funk pop quartet, the Lydian Collective. Todd Baker, thanks for joining.
Nice. You make me sound amazing. Thanks.
That's. I don't need to do that. It does itself. Cool, Todd. Thanks so much for joining the Sync Music Matters podcast.
It's nice to be here.
The question I'd like to open up with, this is the same question I ask all my guests first, is rewind to when Todd Baker was a young boy, sort of pre-10 years old, running around, gallivanting around the mean streets of Evesham. If someone at that time period would have asked you, what would you like to be when you grew up, what would you have replied?
In that time period, interesting. It certainly wouldn't have been music at that point or anything to do with it. Probably something artistic, probably something more visual artistic. I mean, I did like to draw and, I did like art GCSE rather than music GCSE and, graphic design or something like that. I mean, not as pre-10-year-old, but I mean, to be honest, if I was pre-10, I'd probably a fighter pilot in the Air Force because I'd watch Top Gun. There's something completely unrealistic and like whatever 80s thing I was absorbing at the time.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's funny as well because so my first guest, Stephen Warbeck, he wanted to design. He wanted to be an aeronautical engineer of high altitude aircraft. So
amazing, yeah. I mean, did you make the Top Gun link there, or
there was no Top Gun link there because he's a bit older, so probably Top Gun wasn't quite so didn't have quite such an impact on him.
My cousins were actually in the Air Force, and that somehow maybe made me make that leap of it being achievable as well. And that's the mind of the 8-year-old me.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, was it Top Gun? I don't know whether it was Top Gun or Rambo, or there was a certain group of films in the 80s where they actually had conscription people from the army, conscription services outside the movie theatres waiting to sign people up on, come up out of the theatre hyped over what they've just seen and go, yeah, cool, I want to do that.
Yeah, and I think, as I understand it, any film that includes military stuff has to have the sign off of the military even now. You might want to fact check that, but I think that if you're making Iron Man or something and it features military stuff, then they need to kind of sign that off.
Have to sign off. Interesting.
And so there's probably a lot of recruitment for films out there.
So how did you go from being Iceman to composing?
Maverick, obviously.
Maverick, sorry, of course. How did you go from wanting to be Maverick to composing?
Well, even then I would have been playing guitar because I started playing guitar when I was about 5, 6. That I actually sort of picked it up, or I couldn't really pick it up, so I played bass lines with my thumb on the E string on my dad's sort of old nylon string that was up in the roof, like the loft, which wasn't converted. But it would be go up some ladders, one ladder, not some ladders, to this kind of space where Dad had a load of old stuff, and one of those things was his guitar. And I just remember playing bass lines. Dad showed me how to play like Money and like the bass line from like Green Onions and this stuff that he'd learned in the 60s when he had lessons. And Dad didn't really play guitar much, he'd had some lessons and he still had this old guitar. But yeah, I remember playing these bass lines, it not being something that was difficult and being something that kind of made sense. Yeah, you put your thumb on here, it makes a different note. And just the musical side of it, like, and I don't think this is anything that we sort of earn when we're young like this. It just made sense to me, and I could play around. And then that led to, I think, having lessons when I was about 6 and that learning some open chords and stuff. I remember you couldn't have guitar lessons at my school until you were sort of 7 or 8. But I think Mum and Dad managed to get me in earlier because I was sort of, enjoying playing with the guitar. And just learning some open chords. And then again, I don't remember that ever being an effort. Like, it was just fun to pick it up and play with it. And I definitely say that all of my route to music just comes through the guitar, essentially. A relationship with the first instrument, being lucky enough to have that since then is a way to, build a relationship with tonality and rhythm and harmony and just develop your ear. And, I was always just experimenting and making stuff up from a really early age and figuring stuff out as well. I mean, me and my friend Ben Walker, who I learned guitar with, who actually is a sort of folk award-winning musician himself these days. And we sort of figured out like 12-bar blues and stuff and the pentatonic scale, and we'd sort of jam before the lessons in primary school. And
nice.
And it was just, and like I consider that to be entirely a non-earned sort of just fortunate, lucky kind of gift thing to have, that guitar there. Obviously have supportive parents that, weren't in any way pushy, but, they saw that I liked something, so they encouraged it. And then just having the pre-existing ear, which I think is, some people just don't have. You can nurture it to some degree, but I think that's very much nature-based and has been proved to be so, in terms of people that can hear pitch and can and have a good sense of rhythm. They're quite separate things in some way, but yeah, that's very much a nature thing, I think, to a large degree.
And so at what point did you start to sort of think, actually, I might hang up my flying jacket? And at what point did music sort of become a potential reality for a career?
Yeah, honestly, that is down to, and I'd love to find this lady now, but I guess she was quite a young lady, came into our school to do careers advice 1-to-1s when we're sort of 16, just doing our GCSEs, or 15 or whatever. And she was just asking me questions about what I liked and what I enjoyed, essentially. And, as I said, I didn't do, I said to you earlier off mic that I didn't do music GCSE. And, I did art GCSE. She figured out that I enjoyed music and suggested a popular music course that they were doing in a nearby town, Stratford upon Avon in the Midlands. And thanks to her, I went and did this course that was sort of full-time music. I was in a band when I was 15, at that point, and I was doing things with music, but it just did not occur to me that it might be a viable career, because I think certainly where I grew up, that's not what people from Evesham in the West Midlands do when they grow up. I needed to get a proper job and earn some money. And she was encouraging, identified something that I was obviously passionate about, which was amazing. And so I went to study music, and then I think thinking about it seriously as a career obviously came with that. And I remember panicking after like about 2 or 3 weeks, because it felt like it was a bit of a kind of DOS at the time, and I wasn't doing something that was going to earn me any money, and pursuing some kind of hobby. And that's something, to be fair, my dad would say, it's a hobby, not a profession, sort of thing. And my parents were always supportive, but that there was a reality to that as well, that that I think was probably quite an important part of the way I thought about it. Like, that's why I would have panicked and thought that I can't, I'm not going to make a living out of this. I need to go and do maybe at least media studies or something. And
get a proper job.
Exactly, a proper job. And now obviously looking back, then I realized how fortunate I was to have something that I was interested in, and how actually my focus became quite singular after, partway through that course, specifically with the games side of things as well. Already at that point, I liked the idea, the sort of dream of being interested in games, playing games obviously at that time, but thinking, someone's got to make music for these games, and that just sounded like the coolest thing ever. And that became, a pretty singular focus, I think, since maybe I was about 17, really.
So you presumably finish your music course, and I always sort of think this, looking back as well, it's quite a difficult period in life when you kind of finish school or finish university, because up until that point every single year has been mapped out. You've known what you've been doing the following year. There's been not really many unknowns. All of a sudden you're sort of standing on the edge of the abyss where you've got your whole life ahead of you, and you've literally you don't know what's going to happen. How did you sort of take that focus and obviously sort of clear passion for music and sort of go and then turn that into career? What was the progression? What was the first job? What was your experience in that?
Well, I went to university, so that was obviously a continuation of that sort of education story. But yeah, I did, you get spat out at the end of that experience. And again, I was very focused again on a goal. The idea of game audio, music for games, was interesting, and I was open to the sound design side of things as well. So not just making music. And I knew that I'd learned that getting into the games industry via the sound design route was, even if you sort of preferred the idea of being a composer and making music for games, was a good way to do that. And I was, I had the audio production skills, and like it interested me as well. And so, I was, post uni, there's a couple of years where I was just living with my parents, and I was teaching a bit of guitar for money. And, I did work on one library project then, and for a small production music library that doesn't exist anymore. But I was applying for games jobs, throughout that time, and that was more sound design focused for sure. But I got involved in some free projects as well, like as in, projects that would be advertised on websites that they were looking for a team to do something. It was low or no pay. And one thing in particular was I worked on for 3 or 4 months that was no pay. And people often say, don't work for free, etc., etc. In an ideal world, absolutely. But I took a gamble on working on something with these great guys that were in Sweden. It was the early days then of broadband internet. So that was just possible, in 2003, 2004. And worked with these guys on a game project. And I did sound design stuff and I did music for it. And it was really nice. It was really polished, and they pitched it. It never got made as a full production, but that gave me this lovely showreel material that actually then eventually got me my first in-house job at Blitz Games back in the day, which was just an absolute dream. That was mainly sound design work. And I tried to show what I could do musically, and that became, composition became a big part of what I did there. But that was like a dream job, like to go and actually get paid. And I remember in my first couple of weeks, it got to the weekend, and I was like, I just wanted to keep going in and working on the game, because it just just completely opened up a whole experience of working professionally on games, and I learned so much, and I'm so grateful to the three guys that worked there, that which was Matt Black, John Guscott, and Rob Blake. They're all very talented guys, and I realized later how lucky I was to get a job with these very talented musicians and sound designers, and they kind of mentored me a bit. And yeah, I look on those days, certainly the first year of that job was amazing.
Yeah. It's interesting as well, as somebody once told, I heard somebody once say that with anything like this, it's important to find a fan, because somebody who really likes what you do and is in a position to open doors can be sort of like a huge asset. And, essentially, I think this was more in relation to kind of the music industry, commercial music industry. But it's interesting to hear you say that, those, first of all, you did a free project, which, whilst that didn't come to anything, it gave you some showreel material, which isn't just like, oh, here's some stuff I did at uni. But then these guys obviously heard that and thought, this guy's got some talent, and really liked what you did, and gave you a chance. Yeah.
And to the point about having a fan, I mean, it's, you're trying to, I was lucky as well, because I realize now that those are people who were really on my wavelength, and it's kind of cause and effect, I guess. It's because I'd applied to a bunch of places for jobs and heard nothing. I mean, obviously, what I did appealed to the people who were sort of appreciating what I did, and they could see from my stuff that I was obviously a guitarist and stuff, and Matt was a guitarist, they obviously saw something in me. And I was so inexperienced then, like even socially inexperienced. And I remember the intensity of that job, and I felt like I was just surrounded by these really intelligent people. Like everyone there was so smart and on it in a way that I'd never experienced before. Not at university, that was still had elements of a bit kind of dossy and sort of a certain, like not necessarily being sort of as sort of focused in that way. And I had massive imposter syndrome with that stuff as well at the time, in a certain way. I mean, I had some core self-belief as well, but like it was all about needing to up my game very quickly, and but what an amazing opportunity to, because had that not happened, I'd like to think it would have in some other ways, but that's the point where somebody gives you the shot at doing something. And this is a small, well, not small, but because they employed, they went up to 200 people, and you had those kind of game studios at that time, and you have very few of those now. But it was, they were making mainly kids Nickelodeon licenses like SpongeBob and Tack and like various kind of PlayStation 2 era stuff. And I was getting paid, I don't mind saying, I was getting paid 17 grand a year in that job, which back then was okay, but it was, in the Midlands that was okay. But it's, I was on that for years as well, before I sort of started to earn a bit more money with the senior roles and stuff like that.
Yeah. That's really interesting what you say as well about walking into this environment of really intelligent professionals, industry professionals. The more I speak to people within the creative field, it's very hard not to have imposter syndrome ever, whether or not it gets easy with time. But within that environment, you chose to sort of go, okay, well, I can be intimidated by this, or I can go, right, let me look at what they're doing and let me learn from them and sort of take as much from them as possible, because obviously that's how you're going to get good at what you do, is by learning from those that are amazing at it.
Exactly. And it's almost like imposter syndrome of some kind is the pre-existing condition of successful people. And that's not an absolute statement, of course, but like I've found that a lot. If you're entitled in some way and you feel like you're sort of, you're destined in some way to be successful, then that's not a good pre-existing mindset for actually finding it. Like, it's imposter syndrome isn't maybe quite the right word. It's a sort of like not knowing that that people around you are much better at this than you, and that you're going to have to really learn and, and work hard and strive to make yourself, good enough to do this thing. It's a hard mindset, I think, as well, because it's like relentlessly self-critical. It's a constant feeling that you're not good enough, which I would say I definitely have now, despite also having a logical part of my brain that knows that I am, because I've performed well and come up with the goods over and over again. But it's like, in my head, like it's I mean, I hope it's okay to say this, but there's actually a more humbleness as well that I, within my own mind, I probably don't project that always. And I probably come across as being really confident with something, but I'm like, okay, so I can probably do this, maybe this is the time when I can't do this, but like I'm going to try and get my stuff together and get in the right mindset, and I can do this. But it's not like I can do this. It's like it's a very sort of a more subtle self-belief.
And it sounds like in that instance with that company, you approached it with a humility and a curiosity of wanting to sort of learn what you could, rather than sort of go in there and try and prove yourself. I mean, there might be an element of proving yourself, and that sounds like
definitely an element of proving yourself, and that is the flip side of it. It's not saying that ego is not part of it, because it's a huge part of it. But I'm definitely in my sort of inner world. I'm in a world that I don't understand, that I'm not in any way feeling entitled to, and I'm going to have to really up my game in every respect to kind of, to sort of survive and thrive in this environment. Only the best people do that is the way that I would think about it. And I wasn't one of those people, and so would need to do a lot of kind of grafting to try and mix with these people,
with the big boys and girls.
I mean, to be fair, in those days it was probably a game development studio would be 90% guys, 95%, really? And unfortunately,
is it still very male dominated now?
Yes, in certain types of studio, but luckily I work with the kind of studios that I think, getting on for 50-50 in some cases, like Media Molecule, us too. And I take that for granted now. And you notice it when it's not there, because it's a very different vibe.
We'll go into the skin of Monument Valley in a minute. But in terms of, obviously for young people out there who are interested in getting into music, and I suppose specifically composing, and well, I suppose this is the thing, because this is why you're sort of a really interesting guest for the podcast, because obviously I'm looking at the relationship between music and the moving image, and generally people think about sort of composers for TV and film, but within that there's obviously lots of other areas of working with music and the moving image. Editors do that on a regular basis, music supervisors, sync agents, and obviously game composers and sound designers. But for anybody who kind of young people, aspiring composers who sort of want to follow a similar sort of path to you, have you got any thoughts on, and obviously it's a sort of perhaps a different landscape now, but any advice on ways that people can do that?
Yeah, I mean, it is a different landscape, and I do get asked this quite a lot. I'll get messages from people via my website fairly regularly who've played something like Monument Valley or Alto's Odessy, and they really love the music, which is just awesome to get, to know and get that direct feedback of people who, I think it's the nicest feedback you can get, is like somebody not only enjoying it, but also being inspired because they want to do something similar, and in the way that I was inspired by people, when I was younger. But yeah, I think it's different now in the sense that there's probably, and this can't be forced, but there's probably slightly more of a need to be doing your thing, and be thinking about how you can slot into what is ultimately a very competitive world, and know your strengths within that. And because obviously it's a given that people have got to work hard and be good at what they do. but it's not maybe enough to just want to do something well. It's like, trying to be in touch with what your strengths are and to play to them, I think is probably more important than ever. I don't think I thought as much like that. And it's weird that I'm saying that, because I think there's often an overemphasis on that, on the artist's way. And, and I didn't have anything much to say, I have to say, until I was about 30, that might actually feel like actually creative expression of me. Because mostly up until then, I was just interested in trying to make music that sounded professional, basically. That sounded like, it was well produced and it had good hooks in it. I was working on a whole bunch of different genre-based stuff in that early job at Blitz Games, and doing some library stuff as well. And I just wanted to record good sounding guitars and drums, and just, we did a sort of kung fu, very sort of 70s. I was reverse engineering sort of retro stuff and all this stuff that was really creative, but it wasn't like my thing. I was mostly genre composing in one way or another. And so that underpinning, I always say, is really good. So I'm sort of contradicting myself now. Like, definitely have the aspiration to, learn the sort of basic, the wider skills. Like, the first and foremost mindset isn't maybe uniqueness, but it is, once you have that bedrock, and which I do think anyone needs who wants to actually, to make a living or be a professional, then you got to think about the kind of projects you want to get involved in as well, and at least have an idea about that. I would love to work on a film like this, and what, finding people obviously who are like-minded, finding your sort of realizing that you're probably on this creative wavelength, and finding other people like you is going to serve you very well in that respect. So that's definitely something that myself and I know other people have experienced.
Yeah. So there's a focus there, and sort of, rather than just wanting to do, and it's hard, isn't it? Because when you do start out, you kind of do want to try your hand at everything, but at the same time, I remember years ago I went to a meetup for games composing, and I realised very quickly in that room that I felt completely adrift, because I wasn't really into games. This was at a time when I was like, just wanted work, and games composing seems quite cool. But I've never been a gamer. I've never really played games other than, multiplayer stuff. And in that room, it didn't feel right. Not in the same way as if I walk into a film meetup. Automatically there was a connection with everyone around me, because I had that relationship to film. So I think it's interesting that you say kind of, it's playing to your strengths to a certain extent, but also you've said this before about drawing on your influences, which is really interesting, because Stephen Warbeck said something about that as well, in terms of, and this is in terms of kind of focusing down on something and having a unique style. I think you massively have a very unique and wonderful style about your music. In fact, I think if people played me a load of random tracks and there was some of yours that I'd not heard amongst them, I would be able to recognise them, because I think you've got a very unique style, which I don't think is that easy to do. I think it's, as you say, it's like in the beginning you're concentrating on the mechanics of how to produce, how to record, how to mix, and then once all of that sort of becomes second nature, then you can start to go, okay, how do I think you probably do always draw on your influences, but draw on them in a way that then you start to create something unique and a slightly, dare I say, reverence. I always talk about reverence, doing things a bit differently, and I think that definitely shines through in a lot of what you're doing.
Thanks. I mean, like you said, that doesn't come, for me at least, that doesn't come easily, and it is difficult to do. But it's not difficult for everyone, because there were people that I went to university with who were just natural artists, and as in they were unique people, and and they were expressing stuff with their art, their music, and it was really inspiring. And I was not doing that at all at that age. And like I said, it took me a long time to have, in some ways, the confidence, but also the kind of life experience as well, to feel like, you know, I was in a place where I could, I could think, oh, I'm sort of, you know, I've kind of tried to write about this a bit in some blog stuff I've done, you know, for Monument Valley, etc. But it's your unique combination of ideas rather than really, that's where the originality is. It's it's not like you're plucking something completely new out of the air. That does happen rarely. And in some sense, you're always doing that. And in another sense, you're never doing that as well. Because what I think is unique about what I'm doing is that it's a unique combination of ideas sometimes. And I'm doing it in my way because, you know, there'll be a lot of people who make, you know, sort of modal electronic stuff, for example, but not all of them would have been listening to Zappa and Steve Vai and people like that in their teens like I was. And not all of them will maybe have a first instrument like the guitar that they're quite as sort of obsessed with and have played in the same way. And yeah, there'll be just whatever taste magnets that you've been attracted to. That's a unique journey for everybody, for sure.
Yeah. Okay, well, that seems a good point then to go under the skin. Under the skin. So we'll talk about Monument Valley 2. So talk us through your process. So you get approached by a games company. They want you to do the sort of sound design, create the atmosphere and the music for Monument Valley 2. Where do you start?
Well, in that case, it's a sequel. And, you know, a lot of what I've actually worked on recently has been the same with Alto's Odessy. I have the fortune of seeing a completed version of a game that is something like the thing you're making. It's not going to be the same, but that's actually a bit of a blessing, really, a bit of a gift in terms of if you're working on something completely new. To work on Monument Valley 1, which I didn't, then it would probably sound very different to what I did for 2. And there was something established in its art style, for sure, in the audio that Stafford had done on Monument Valley 1 that had a very sort of synth, sort of drone-based approach to it. And I liked parts of that. But obviously I had a lot of ideas about how I would make that different. And I mean, interestingly, what I did, and this was a lovely thing to do at the start of that project, was just spend a couple of weeks making a quick ideas sketch thing that was like an album of music. That was, and that was very early on before we knew what Monument Valley 2 was going to be. So I actually, made a whole album, which we actually put out on Spotify as well. And nobody kind of knows about it because it was under like a pseudonym. It was Danny's idea, us two, to do that. And
so like a Spotify playlist of,
and it's actually on as an album. It's because it's not tagged as me as an artist, but some of the tracks on it became music on the game, and it was basically like writing a library album, if you like, of stuff that was exploring, and it was really nice. It was really experimental, and I was just doing some quite dark stuff that wouldn't have gone in the game, and then exploring just some different sound palettes, and it allowed me to get a little bit of a feel and figure out some musical style and combination, and that was a really nice bit of groundwork for.
Can you remember the name of the album?
Yeah, I can.
I'll link to it in the show notes.
Yeah, do. It was called Early Conceptual Works, and the artist's name is Sound Circle, I think.
So this is basically an album of your demos.
Yeah, exactly. It is. And amazing. The fact that we released it was just a kind of, we wondered if, I don't know, we didn't even tweet about it, we just put it out. I think it was almost like a bit of a PR experiment, it was Danny's thinking on it, and which sort of didn't work. But it's here. There's a whole 13-track album, and people would, if they've heard the Monument Valley soundtrack would recognise a few of the tracks on there, which are
Well,
pretty
there you
much
go.
one
There's
for
a
one.
little Easter egg, because I wasn't
there you
even
go.
aware of that, so I'm very interested to check that out. Okay, so you've created this album, or you've created this sort of demo reel, you immersed yourself and experimented with different sounds and sort of come up with a creative angle. And then can you just explain a little bit about Monument Valley as well for anyone, because obviously you move through multiple levels, you're on this sort of little journey. Can you just explain a bit what it is, and then also then how you went about addressing music and sound design for each level?
Yeah, well, it's a story ultimately, and I think it is a more narrative-driven game than the original. It's quite a sort of clean story of a mother and child who, with a sort of coming of age element to it, where at sort of the end of Act 1, the child essentially leaves and goes off to grow up and have experiences of their own. And interestingly, it chooses to stay with the mother rather than show the child's adventure. You do kind of pick that up again later in the story, but it has a nice focus on the mother experiencing life without her child, which obviously, as a motherhood story, which it was meant to be, is a big component. The child obviously becomes your life, and then you regaining that life as the child becomes more independent is a really, I think, a nice kind of pivot point around a motherhood story. I think I was, to be honest, that game came together very quickly. So like realizing like nuanced ideas in the score was more by instinct than by planning. And if, for example, Interwoven Stories, which is one of the kind of title tracks, along with the trailer track of the kind of branded tracks, that actually gets its name from a point in the development where that game, the mother-child story, was one of, I think, 5 other small short stories that was going to be Monument Valley 2. It was going to be like 5 different stories with a lot more bigger scale and ambitious. And it happened that it just worked, and thematically the interwoven stories of the child and the mother, it was a track that I made early on again, after that, doing that concept album, if you like. But it did form a basis of the sound of the game because people liked it, and I think it was influencing the tone of the game, as the art was being developed and the music was being developed, then that these things kind of, they solidified to form a thing. And in terms of what I'm doing, there's obvious moments there, like there's obvious emotional things to punctuate. The moment when the child leaves, I think, is one that a lot of people call out as being like, it's some people cry when they play that bit, and which is lovely in a good way. And I actually really love the level just after that, because that's when the mother's alone for the first time. And the art that David did on that level is grayscale, basically. So it's, it's black and white, just pale world, and it's empty. And so with both the music and the sounds in that section, I pretty much go to kind of noise, and I take the tonality out of the navigation ping, which when you click to move the player, so it's just this kind of noisy, crackly thing. And then slowly he introduces, it's like a moment of the feeling of emptiness that you might experience in that moment. And then color starts to come back into the world, and I'm sort of trying to follow that from going from essentially like noise-based to tonality. And I'm working on that. I think the reunion moment as well is another key thing that's punctuated, and that's probably one of the most scored sequences. It has a sort of piano strings thing going on there. It's the most kind of Hollywood moment, if you like, in that game. And and then a lot of it was just, trying to do more broad strokes, kind of expressionist sort of stuff in the same way that the art was. They were just, there's a point in the game where you're just basically on a cake, or 3 cakes floating in some pink void, and it's abstract. And that's, I think the music, again, was I thinking about this at the time? Probably not. But it just was natural to just be more experimental than I usually would be, and just go with whatever I think is is going to fit with that imagery in the same way that I don't think the cake has any specific relevance. I might be wrong there. But it's, there's always with Monument Valley, there's a room to just be playful, I think, with the creative side, the aesthetic side of it.
Yeah. And to what extent are you kind of relying on the visuals to inform what's happening with the music? Do you sort of sit there composing whilst with the visuals sort of running in the background, or do you sort of tend to switch them off?
Absolutely, as much as possible. Yeah, if it's a screenshot or if it's a bit of video capture and obviously with a game, this is often work in progress as well, which is, you get that in film, but an early cut of something in film is at least it's coming out of the same material that will be edited. In a game, often big things can change and do change very late. But yeah, absolutely. I feed off narrative and I feed off visual, tone. And without that, I feel, I enjoy doing that more. And, perhaps when we talk about, making music for the sake of music as a separate subject, but ultimately, I enjoy doing something that's part of a story and part of a bigger tone. I like making music in that context, probably more than I like, certainly on my own, just trying to just make music, which can be fun, but, and I can make my own story up, but it's just more, it's more fulfilling for me to be part of a wider thing that is telling a story. And I'm feeding off obviously narrative there and the tone and the taste, which is really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it's obviously, when it comes to writing music for TV and film, it's quite obvious that you're following a narrative, but it's also true that in games is that always the case that you're serving a narrative, or is it just on specific games?
Yeah, it depends on the definition of narrative, but it's definitely not always the case, no. But, if you play Tetris, then there's a narrative of you start playing the level and there's no blocks on the screen, and then you'll start putting blocks down, and then at some point things will probably get quite difficult, and then maybe you'll recover from that, and then you'll maybe you'll recover twice on Tetris from being nearly dead or whatever you call it when the blocks go to the top. But
the music speeds up, doesn't it, and changes, so it sort of adds that level of tension. Absolutely,
and on the more recent Tetris games and the original, in fact, isn't it double speed when you get to exactly, yeah. So that's a narrative, it's not exactly a narrative in the same way that I'm talking about Monument Valley, and it's not a narrative in the same way that you talk about The Last of Us, which is essentially, you'd compare that to a movie. There's always, depends on your definition of narrative, but of course there's a player journey of some kind involved in every game experience, and you're looking at how you can support that. And yeah, I'm happy to call that narrative, in the sense of Tetris.
And just touching on something you mentioned earlier as well about obviously Monument Valley, there was Monument Valley 2 that you worked on, and the being in a Monument Valley, and it sounds like the process is a little bit different because obviously there has to be a deference to what's come before. So how does that then compare to something, say, like Alto's Odessy, whereby you're sort of starting, you've got carte blanche, you can do whatever you want? How does that change your process?
So Alto's Odessy is a sequel as well. Land's End is an example of something that's completely new, which I did with Ustwo, and that is a different feeling, and it's one that I have to say, I very much have enjoyed working on, being the Monument Valley 2 guy and the Alto's Odessy guy, but I'm craving, certainly in what I'm looking for in projects now, is to be working on something new. And I think when I think about Land's End, that was a very enjoyable thing to work on. I probably enjoyed working on that as much, if not more, than anything I've worked on. And that was probably partly because it was creating something from scratch and it was a new world. And to your point about Dreams, that's entirely a new world. I suppose the main difference there is I'm part of a team of people. I did a lot of the key sort of branded sound of that game. The whole, when you first play the game, everything you're hearing in the first sort of 5-minute intro is my work. But that's such a huge project that goes beyond composition, and there's a lot of talented musicians and audio people working on that contributed to a whole bunch of that's a creative platform, not just the music in it, but the tools that other people will use to make their own music. And so I was working on instrument design for that, for example. So that's a completely different mindset, that closer to people who make software instruments, who make contact libraries, or a lot of the work I did on that which was super fun, was building instruments for other people to be creative with. A whole other world.
And it seems as though, I always like this in certainly in film, when there's a very blurred line between music and sound design, where those two worlds kind of meld together. It certainly sounds like, given that you are a sound designer and a composer, and certainly within Monument Valley, it felt like those two worlds definitely converged. Is that something that you'll try to bring to each project as well?
I think that what you just said there, if I have a thing, then that's definitely, I think one of the main things that I'm doing, and one of the main things that I'm talking about in relation to my work often, is that within a team, if I'm working with people, then I'm trying to get people to think about those things as being more interrelated than they often are in games. Because it's fun. Monument Valley is a perfect platform to do that, but films are doing that all the time, like you say, and they're choreographed, and I see little reason to think about these disciplines as being separate. Ultimately, logistically, they often have to be, because one person can't always do everything. But all the work I did in Dreams, in Monument Valley, Land's End, Alto's Odessy, there's a lot of tonality in what's happening sound design wise. And the music could be considered to be sound design in many places as well. It's not, it would be more textural and very minimal, and is just a drone in E considered music? Yes, of course it can be, but it's, some people, when editing a film, then there'll be drones and tones stuff that is considered sound design, which is not, what the composer's been working on. Like, I see it's absolutely just a simple logic to me, is that this is all part of the same wider composition, essentially. You can think of the whole thing as one piece of music or one piece of sound design, and it's really fun. And, hearing the work that Martin Stig Andersen did on Limbo and Inside, those are two games that, to me, those are the examples of, they're probably, people would say they're more weighted towards what you would call sound design, but there's some beautiful tonality in what he's doing as well, really minimal. And in terms of how the whole thing's being woven together, to tell a story, and in the case of Inside, the way it becomes integral even to the gameplay, that's really inspiring stuff for me, I think. I'm trying to do that. Usually, I've been trying to do that on most of the projects I've worked on in the last, in my freelance years, which has been the last sort of 8 years or so.
Yeah, sure. So obviously it's very easy to kind of find the successes in the life and times of Todd Baker, but I always think some of the experiences from which we learn the most are actually the failures, the places where we sort of come up short. Have you got an example of like the kind of the biggest mistake you've ever made, or a couple of mistakes that you've made, and what were the learnings from those? Assuming you do make mistakes.
Yeah, I mean, I do see very clear. I've had a lot of very difficult experiences working in certain situations, especially with certain people. More not so much personal like that, but actually, in bigger companies where the kind of bosses of the companies, there's some kind of clash and I don't think I've been the only one feeling that. It's been usually part of a bigger problem, and there's a lot to learn from with that. I think that, this comes down to what I always talk about as a wavelength thing. And you learn a lot from working in a situation where you don't feel like you're able to do your thing. You feel possibly underappreciated in some ways, or you feel like you're not able to even do the things that would earn the respect of somebody and stuff. And these are all the indicators of you're doing the wrong thing. You're not working with the right people, essentially. This happens often in big companies because it's really hard to get 200 people or maybe 100 people working on one project that are actually creatively aligned in a significant way. So that's a massive, I've had tough times when, you feel like I'm not creatively inspired. I'm not doing, I might have the respect of my immediate peers in the audio department, but, I'm not really able to do my thing in a wider context, and it's frustrating and stuff like that.
What's helped you navigate that?
Mainly, I've definitely made mistakes, and the mistakes would be staying in that situation for too long. So what helps is, in hindsight, noticing that and then knowing when to say, I need to do something else. And, financial reasons, personal reasons might make that very difficult, and they have done for me in the past. But if you have a sort of, you've had experience of things being good, which everyone needs to find in their own way, and then at some point things are bad, then you need to figure out what was good about the old stuff. It sounds simple, and what's not working about, the thing that you're doing, and then find a way to make some positive changes. And, that comes with a huge amount of anxiety and, tentative, am I doing the right thing? Can I afford, literally or psychologically, to make this, to drop this thing because it's, maybe it's paying the wage, or, learning the situations that you work best in. And I think that the centerpiece of that is the people you're working with, and trying to work with people. And my experience from the lows of the worst situation I've been in is, I managed somehow to turn that around to a point where I then, a year or so later, I'm working with a studio like Media Molecule, where the ease of being in that situation, surrounded by just amazing people who are so supportive and so positive about what you're doing, and the confidence feedback loop that brings, is just like so relieving. Because you're like, oh, I was right that I felt bad in that situation previously, or it was right for me at least.
The same could be said for personal life as well. Is like the people that you surround yourself very much goes to informing how you are on a daily basis. And I suppose it ties in with what you were saying as well before about, like, you felt, the thing you said about the age of 30, you felt like you had the mechanics of making music down, and you had the life experience to be able to then kind of inform stylistically what you were doing and what you were about. And it's interesting because it just highlights the sort of, whilst we tend to think of sort of our work life and personal life as separate, actually they're hugely interlinked, and something negative going on in one can affect the other. So actually looking at it from a more holistic point of view probably makes, and having that awareness, like you say, like, okay, that didn't work for me, what didn't work, and that was amazing, what was right about it, so that hopefully then going forward you can try and avoid the negatives and sort of bring more of the positives.
You're just so right. And it sounds simple, doesn't it? But like that, these things are often so emotionally complex, but that's exactly it. And you're so right to the environment as well. Moving city for me is probably the biggest explanation of, I can talk about my approach to the music in Monument Valley too, but that's so intrinsically tied with a period of my life working with Ustwo when I first moved to London, and an evolution of relationships and friendships with people in that studio, and that makes the music sound different. ultimately, because my whole life experience is vastly different to what it was some years before, when I was living in a different city and I was in a different relationship and things were, quieter. And it's fascinating.
Yes, it really is an advertisement as well for, in terms of creativity, a kind of a richness of life experience all feeds into your creativity, because it's all too easy to sort of get bogged down into routine and what have you. But interesting you say that even moving house or a relationship you're in or whatever's going on in your social life, that kind of all feeds back into you individually, so therefore actually in what you're doing creatively. So rich life experience is where creativity thrives.
I know, absolutely. And that doesn't, for some people that's traveling the world and, like an experience of different cultures and stuff. And for some people, like that's, different difficult relationships or in something closer to home. And that takes, variation in and richness of life experience takes many different forms. And I think it's good, obviously, having a bit of all of those things, which is kind of what I've tried to do. I think, seeing other places in the world, like really getting yourself out of your own head and realizing the bubble you live in when you're in the Nepalese mountains or whatever is very valuable. But there's interpersonal relationships and difficult times or good times in that respect is very character building as well. Yeah,
definitely. Cool. Okay, well, I think it's time to get a taste. Getting a taste. Something obviously we haven't talked about thus far is your involvement in the Lydian Collective, which may feed directly into this sort of the kind of next segment, which is what, I know this is very difficult to sort of answer generally, but what resonates with you musically? Whilst I understand you probably have an appreciation of an eclectic blend of different music and things like that, what just makes you want to go, yes!
It's got two different axes, that thing for me. On the one hand, like, I love just a really good harmonic pop hook of some kind. And when I say pop hook, I'm referring to a Steve Vai riff as much as I'm referring to a Michael Jackson, Quincy Jones era tune that is just like harmonically beautiful, and the arrangements and the harmony is just triggering that thing in my brain. I love modal harmony and, just nice things like Steely Dan that are, again, it's kind of pop, but it's like, it's on the edge of jazz. And like, there's these fruity chords that just sound lovely and they trigger that thing in your brain. And then the other end of the thing for me is closer to this storytelling thing and what I'm doing professionally and what I love to do. It's like a moment in a film, and it might not be musically a thing that I would spend time listening to, in its own right, but some deep emotion is being conjured that is really channeling through what's happening in terms of a soundtrack or some, audio cue and stuff like that. And that like inspires me deeply, and I love it. Gives me a different type of experience. But it is, it's bigger than music, but it's obviously it's very music based in the way that I'm feeling about it at the time. Yeah.
Well, so you've mentioned Steely Dan, you sort of mentioned Quincy Jones and the sort of kind of Michael Jackson. Are there kind of like specific that you can think of at the moment, seminal albums from, going back to when you were a young child to sort of today, which you sort of credit with having because as well, we were talking about this on drawing on influences into sort of doing something unique, but are there certain seminal albums you can name from your...
There's loads, and there's specific tracks as well, and some of them are quite obscure. But I mean, the album that I would say is my favourite album for a variety of reasons is just my sort of teenage guitar hero, one of my teenage guitar heroes, Steve Vai. The Passion and Warfare album is just pure like creativity to me. It's like that's as close as inventing a new style of music as you get. I was saying about originality earlier, and of course he was totally combining his influences at that point. And this was an album he thought that nobody would give a crap about. It was, he literally thought, having been in these big 80s bands with David Lee Roth or whoever it was, that, and being a bit of a rock star, that this was his kind of side passion project. But that was people talk about an artist actualization or whatever, self-realization. That's an example of somebody just making the music that he had in his head. And I didn't know any of this. I wasn't thinking about it on this level when I was 12 or whenever I first heard that. But there's something just so special about that was not like anything I was listening to at the time. And it's, it's a wailing guitar album, but it's compositionally just absolutely incredible as well. And I still think, and, I was lucky enough to see in 2016, he performed that whole album in the 25th anniversary, I think, in London. And I still love that music as much now as I did back in the day. And people might be who've heard my, sort of often quite chill Monument Valley-esque stuff, might be surprised to hear that. I think that those kind of influences come through more in something like the Alto's Odessy stuff. It's a lot more muso-y in its weird time signatures and, this harmonic stuff. And certainly the band as well is an expression of that stuff.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, certainly from my point of view, I know Todd Baker can. I know Todd Baker can belt out a face melter, a shred of face melter with the best of them. So, but yeah, and it's interesting as well as a fellow guitarist. Steve Vai, Joe Satriani. There was a kind of virtuosity to their guitar playing, which was just sort of like mesmerizing when you're kind of learning Guns N' Roses riffs and things like that as a kid.
Mm-hmm. But it's modal harmony that's the centerpiece of their composition as well. And just the most Lydian-y stuff, the most Dorian-y stuff, and coaxing just absolute beauty out of these modes, and in doing interesting shifts with that, in their composition. And so that, it's in pop anyway, but they have a certain way of approaching that stuff, I think, that is just wired into my brain as an influence.
Yeah, sure. What else? Any other albums?
I'm undoubtedly influenced by a lot of electronic stuff, and this is stuff that I wouldn't listen to these days, but, back in the day, listening to Left Field or something like that was like a massive influence. And I don't really listen to that stuff now. But the minimalism, and I think that we're seeing a lot of the, film composers and people like myself who grew up in the 90s on a lot of electronic stuff, which is essentially a big popular wave of minimalism, a lot of it, sort of quite repetitive, drum loops and breaks and stuff. A lot of that stuff. There's specific tracks, like there's this one track by Howie B, which on a 90s album, I think it's called Limbo. And it's just like, it wouldn't sound particularly groundbreaking now, but at the time it's so warm and so sort of slightly saturated and interesting sonically that, like, something like that I would slightly obsess over, and a lot of the music I was creating at uni was sort of trying to be a bit like that track. But there's so much stuff, and on the soundtrack side, the one that I think of a lot, again, this would sound, you listen to the soundtrack in isolation and it feels like so much music you would see on drama stuff these days. I still think it's very beautiful and perfectly executed for what it was, but the American remake of Solaris with George Clooney, which I loved that film, and then I think Cliff Martinez did this score for that, which was minimalist, metallic percussion. I think gamelan, possibly steel drums, I think are quite in the mix, like used softly. I think it was before like hang drum, like, hand pan type instruments, but it sounds like that. And of course, like hang drum, stuff gets used all the time now. But yeah, at the time, in whenever it was, 2002 maybe, or even before then, maybe 2001. It was so, like, that married with the visuals of this planet, and because I love my sci-fi, is like, just such a deep, resonant experience. And I'm sure if anybody who might have listened to my recent work and you listen to that, there's an obvious link in its sort of emotional tone. And yeah.
Well, it's interesting because I might be wrong, and I will fact check myself on this, but I seem to think that for that score, Cliff Martinez had literally just got a load of steel pans or sort of like metallic percussion stuff, and he decided, like, okay, I'm going to do the whole score on. I think so.
Maybe you're right. I mean, that would make sense. And it is, at the time, I thought it was just inspired because he's got these deep sub-bass things that he uses in it as well. And that is entirely my thing. And I do this all the time. I'll have some minimalist cyclic thing moving and then quite a deep sustaining bass line that moves underneath it and sort of changes the harmonic modal context of that. Like, of floating around some Dorian, Lydian thing. And it's not complicated. And a lot of pop's doing exactly the same thing. But like the richness of a like really nice sonic palette doing something cyclic and minimalist with a deep sub bass tone. I think that's massively, and that Howie B track was a bit that as well.
Interesting. So you touched on earlier about music providing, it's an emotional language, and you're sort of connecting people with whatever medium they're watching, whether it be games or TV, film. Is there a piece of music or pieces of music which kind of can almost bring you to tears?
Absolutely, yeah. Music in its own right that does that. Something like Katrina McKay, who's a Scottish harp composer and player. There's a few of her compositions. Is this beautiful Celtic folk that is just so deep and resonates with me so much. It's music in its own right that just can certainly make me feel very emotional. I think that often to really kind of get tears going, I jump to the kind of film reference stuff as well, and sometimes it's like you can't separate it from the story then, so it's music in its own right. But there is music just you can listen to. I can listen to the Jurassic Park, that main hook, the dun 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 dun, like seeing that perform live as well, which I have like once or twice. I just start kind of getting all teared up because it's like it's fucking perfect. Excuse my language. It's perfect.
Yeah,
and like it's so exciting, and so it makes me well up now thinking about it. It's so beautiful.
It's John Williams, isn't it? He has exactly the same effect to me. Jurassic Park, but certainly Star Wars. It just, and as you say as well, I think it's interesting because it's married to a time of nostalgia, and it's married to the film as well. But that speaks to kind of like the power of music, and actually, each of those things, visuals and music in their own right are powerful, but when they combine, there's kind of this sort of synergy, and to be able to just like just tears streaming down your streaks as you sort of listen to an orchestra playing it live.
And I think just to go back to, I think it is important to separate music out when you talk about this as well, and to think what purely musical experiences can conjure that kind of emotion, because there's some real magic going on when that does happen. And, I think about, there's a performance that it might still be on YouTube of Hiromi, the Japanese pianist composer, doing a track called Place to Be, I think it's called. A Place to Be, or just Place to Be. And it's quite a thing to watch because she's actually crying as she's playing it, And there's a recorded studio version of that track, which is nice, but it's nowhere near what that particular live performance captures. And my goodness, same with the Katrina McKay track. Pierre Ben-Susan, an acoustic guitarist who's massively influential on me. In my 20s, I started finger picking on acoustic and tuning into DADGAD on the acoustic guitar and stuff, and composing as well for solo acoustic guitar. Again, quite separate from my games work and the soundtrack stuff that might be familiar. There's stuff on YouTube of me playing my solo guitar stuff that I'm still really proud of. And Pierre Ben-Susan was a huge influence with that. And his ear for harmony and his just tenderness, and he does a certain Celtic thing and a certain nostalgic thing as well. It's just music in its own right, and both him and Hiromi doing this as a single person on an instrument, they're real masters, and it's just yeah, it's absolutely beautiful.
Yeah. It's incredible what you say as well, isn't it, about the fact that she was actually crying whilst performing it, because that,
which some people struggle with. Some people struggle to watch something like that and find it somehow a bit, I don't know, it's not pretentious, but like find it a little bit like much.
Yeah, but to my mind, that's what powerful musical performance is about. That's why, love her or hate her, Adele, when she sings about loss, you believe her. She's performing it. She makes you feel like she's feeling it at that moment when she's singing it. And I always think that with a great performance. And interesting, something I touched on with them in the Stephen Warbeck interview was how actually nowadays, sometimes because we're working in computers and we're working to click tracks, that can actually sometimes hold us back, because by sticking to a rigid sort of tempo map, doesn't allow the freedom. Obviously, it makes life a lot easier from a technical point of view, but doesn't allow quite the same freedom of expression around. And actually, just being conscious of that, certainly when it comes to sort of an incredibly emotive performance, can go a long way to capturing.
Completely. And nothing's taught me more about that than playing and recording with the band, with Lydian Collective, because we still have learning all the time about what actually captures a good performance, and often a producer has the role of trying to make that happen, and we record and produce our own stuff, which makes that particularly difficult sometimes. But it's absolutely bizarre the way that you can have what feels like a technically accurate, or you're feeling it, but it won't sound anything like when you were, on stage at the Green Man Festival and playing it with this whole other level of energy. And, it is, like you say about a click track, undoubtedly that confining yourself in that way can really suck the life out of stuff. But sometimes not, like I mentioned Steely Dan, they recorded to click a lot, but it sounds a certain way. And interestingly, seeing some of that music recently performed by a sort of project of London session people at Ronnie Scott's, is the Steely Dan project. I think they're called the Royal Scammers, and they are performing the music as it was in the studio. And this music that you've loved for ages, and I've never seen it live. I mean, Steely Dan did perform that stuff in the 90s and later, but it wasn't the same really. It was a different thing with different musicians. And these guys just do it as it was on the record, but you hear it live and it isolates that difference. And it's like, this is better. I love this music already and the studio's great, but you hear it perform live with that energy and the tempo shifts and the volume to some degree as well. And the energy is incredible, the way it brings it to life.
Definitely, and I always talk about it's the imperfections that we love. The imperfection in rhythm is the groove. The imperfection but it's also and anyone who hasn't seen the Lydian Collective play live, I would massively. I know I'm not saying this just because you're on the podcast. I've been to a lot of your gigs, and the energy of you rehearse and you are so tight, but at the same time there is an energy which is just, you can't be denied when you guys play live on stage. But actually, I think, having said that, I do actually think you have done really well in capturing that energy on your albums as well, because I think all too often there's a huge cavern of difference between sort of what's been captured in the studio versus what you hear on stage. And whilst there is a difference with that, I think you've done really well in capturing the energy in the studio when you're recording the band, because obviously it's kind of, am I right in thinking it was born first and foremost out of playing live rather than recording?
The composition, or
just the Lydian Collective, did it form around sort of you guys playing live rather than sort of like?
No, it was formed out of it's compositions that existed before really. A lot of Aaron's stuff. Obviously, he's writing sort of 70% of the stuff or 75% of the stuff, and the music that we'd made together and individually was the kind of root for that. But yeah, certainly turning them into band arrangements is a process that happens when we're together, and it's a really nice process to put something together in that way. I mean, it's nice that you say that it comes across. I think that you see criticisms of the first album we did that say it's a bit kind of it can be a bit too kind of clean or regimented, and I think we all get that. Certainly Aaron and I definitely get that that criticism. And actually, the second album, which we've been working on, which is pretty much ready to be released soon. I think there's a confidence about it where the looseness and a bit of chaos thrown in there is in better balance, to my taste at least. And some of the tracks I think work better than others on the first album, and that's probably true of this. But I think, there's a slightly more confident way of going about recording, going with a take. There'll be a lot more imperfections on it in its own way, which hopefully would be welcome to a listener.
When is the new album out?
We don't have a release date yet, but it's probably early next year, I would imagine.
Okay. Have you got a title ready for it yet?
We have, and it hasn't been sort of put out there yet. I don't want to jump the gun on that one, but because it's not super confirmed. But yeah,
okay. But watch this space for 2022, beginning of 2022, New Lydian Collective. Well, we'll come to that in a minute. I'll ask you whereabouts we can sort of find all this. Just before we sort of wrap up, I've got a sort of few quick fire. I've got a trivia question for you. I like to do a bit of trivia in terms of, I'm always kind of obsessed with like weird random facts about sort of film or music. And obviously there's one specific about Monument Valley, which I'm pretty sure you'll know the answer to, but which popular TV series did Monument Valley appear in?
I do know this because it's House of Cards, isn't it?
Yes.
With Kevin Spacey playing. I've
Frank
never watched
Underwood.
it, but there's a scene where he plays. It's the original Monument Valley 1. And isn't he playing it on like the sofa or something? And in the Oval Office or something.
Yeah, it's like literally in the White House, sort of killing his bit of downtime playing Monument Valley, which is great. And another bit of trivia I had. Have you got any trivia that you'd like to throw in? Have you got anything?
I totally suck at this kind of stuff. Yeah, okay. I kind of don't absorb it, I guess. It's always interesting, but I don't absorb those kind of facts.
Oh, I have
hit me up with some more.
A great retention of kind of irrelevant minutiae. Okay, here's a cool sound design one related to Terminator 2. So Terminator 2, the T-1000, played by Robert Patrick, he's in the mental institute where there's a rescue mission for Sarah Connor going on, and he walks through the bars, the liquid metal, he walks through the bars. Do you know what was used for the sound of him, the metal moving through the bars?
Yeah, I have heard this before, someone gave me that bit of trivia. It might have been from you, but yeah, I don't. And is it something unusual?
It's something very. It kind of ruins the sort of magic.
Is it synthesized?
No,
it's not like a low synth sweep or something. It's very. I remember it. It's very tactile and gloopy, isn't it?
Yeah, it's actually a can of inverted dog food.
There you go.
So literally just Foley mic'd up some dog food sliding out of a tin. Try watching that scene again now without sort of going, like, being able to smell dog food.
Oh, God, yeah. No, now you say it, it doesn't ring a bell. But yeah, I can imagine it, just the way it slops out of the can with that little bit of sort of captured air thing.
Yeah.
It'd be a good one.
Absolutely.
Nice. I like it.
And just a couple of quick fire questions to finish off with. Little known fact about Todd Baker?
Little known fact about me. I don't read or write music. I can't read notation.
Wow.
I mean, I know the system in terms of, like, I know what a crotchet is. I know where that it's, FACE or whatever. But you probably somebody who heard something like my Alto's Odessy stuff, and people ask for the score because they want to perform it, which is really humbling and lovely, but there isn't a score. And when I've had that stuff done, someone else has done it, so that might be an interesting one.
Well, I mean, I'm much more in the camp of playing by ear rather than sort of like the theory side of things, and I kind of defend my position on the basis that if music is meant to elicit an emotion, actually how it feels and how it sounds is more important than the theory side of it. But as I say, that's just my get out for being. I almost blew my music theory when it came to getting my grade 8 on my saxophone, just because it seems counterintuitive to sort of. It's the mathematical side of things. And it was, you mentioned earlier as well about, you just with the music, you just got it. There's that brilliant scene in Good Will Hunting where Minnie Driver and Matt Damon's obviously the sort of the maths wizard, and Minnie Driver plays the piano, and in a way that Matt Damon can look, well, not Matt Damon can, but his character can look at this sort of like complex board of mathematical formula and just get it. And whilst Minnie Driver sees nothing, she just sort of looks at a piano keyboard and just gets it. Whereas to Matt Damon, it means nothing. And I think there's almost a left brain, right brain element to that almost.
Yeah.
What scares Todd Baker?
Doing podcasts.
Hey, or as I'm calling it, Toddcast. Nice,
I like it. People.
people are pretty scary.
Who I absolutely need and love. But yeah, most of my anxiety is social, definitely.
Right, and people. Yeah. And finally, if you could go back in time and give your younger self one piece of advice, what would it be? Don't be scared of people.
Don't be scared. Give less of a fuck. Again, excuse my language, but like, yes, I would like somebody to have said that to me a lot sooner. And it obviously doesn't mean in relation to the people you care about and what you care about in the world. But yeah, there's definitely a place for sensitive, creative people to go to, which is very unhealthy. When it comes to a level of caring that can be self-destructive and about yourself, by all means. I'm not saying some kind of altruistic thing. It's like it's very much entangled in ego and your own self-expectation and relentless sort of self-improvement. It's a common thing, but somehow, like, do things with passion and intensity, but like have some level of detachment from it where you give less of a shit, and it that has to be part of the mix sometimes, because otherwise you tear yourself into pieces, and many people do.
Yeah. Sound advice. So Todd, if people want to find you, I'm going to put. There's a lot of references you've made throughout the chat about different music, which I'm going to put links to in the show notes. But if people want to find Todd Baker, the Lydian Collective, where do they go?
Yeah, so with Lydian Collective stuff, then a quick Google search will throw up websites and any gigs that we have in the diary. But for myself, I'm on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, I'm at the Todd Baker on Twitter. I don't use it a lot, and it's more like a LinkedIn, which I do have a LinkedIn as well now. But yeah, and on Spotify as well, just a quick search for my name should throw up, soundtrack stuff. Usually pretty easy to find. There's quite a few Todd Bakers in the world, but fortunately not a lot of musicians, I think. So
Todd Baker. Yeah, well, actually, when I searched Todd Baker, it was like the football chant goes, there's only one Todd Baker. I immediately found you.
Amazing.
So awesome. Todd, thanks very much for joining me on Sync Music Matters.
Oh man, it's an absolute pleasure, and it's been really fun.
Thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed this episode, and given that you've listened this far, I feel you might have, then I would be honoured and incredibly grateful if you could take a moment to subscribe, rate and review on your podcast platform of choice. By subscribing, you'll automatically be notified each time a new episode drops, and by rating the show, you tell the artificial intelligence that will soon be running the world that this podcast is worth listening to. I certainly get a lot of insights and value from these conversations, and I genuinely hope you do too. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, then you can email me, podcast@larpmusic.com. Larpmusic.com is my digital abode, and the home of the podcast is larpmusic.com/Sync Music Matters Podcast. And Sync Music Matters Podcast is hyphenated. Thanks again for listening, and until next time.